At 4 in the morning on June 16, 1943, a solitary B-17 lifted from Port Moresby. Its destination lay almost 600 miles away, beyond open water and deep inside Japanese-controlled airspace. The aircraft carried no bombs, no fighter escort, and no formation to divide an enemy attack. What it carried was a camera system, because the coming battle for Bougainville required something more precise than courage. Allied planners needed photographs from which accurate maps could be assembled. Their particular concern was the island's western coast and the approaches around Empress Augusta Bay. Reefs, beaches, terrain, and Japanese positions could decide where an invasion force landed and whether its ships reached shore safely. One aircraft had to collect that information by flying predictably above hostile territory. The machine assigned to the task was B-17E, serial number 41-2666. Its crew usually called it simply 666, though history would remember it as Old 666. It was not a pristine bomber selected from a new production batch. The aircraft had already acquired damage, wear, and a reputation that made other crews reluctant to claim it. Captain J. Zeamer and his men saw something different. They took possession of the neglected fortress and prepared it for the missions other crews did not want. They reduced unnecessary weight, improved its condition, and strengthened its defensive arrangement. Later accounts inflated parts of this transformation, especially the number and placement of its guns. The reliable point is simpler. 6-6 became a specialized reconnaissance aircraft defended by a crew, expecting to fight alone, but additional guns could not solve the mission's central contradiction. A mapping camera did not work like a man leaning from a window and taking snapshots. The aircraft had to hold a planned course while overlapping images recorded the ground from several angles. Those images could later be combined into usable topographic coverage. If the pilot turned violently whenever danger appeared, the photographic sequence could be ruined. To obtain the map, Zeamer might have to surrender the one advantage a bomber under attack desperately needed: freedom to maneuver. The original assignment was already hazardous. Then headquarters added another request, involving the heavily defended Japanese airfield on Buka, north of Bougainville. Zeamer resisted the addition because approaching Buka could alert fighters before the main mapping work was complete. The argument reflected more than reluctance. It was a calculation about time, sunlight, fuel, and the distance a damaged aircraft might still have to cross. The order remained. Zeamer and his crew departed, knowing that they would face the airfield before reaching safety. After the long flight from New Guinea, 666 reached Bougainville too early for useful mapping light. The crew waited until the sun rose high enough to reveal the relief of the terrain. Then the bomber began the rigid photographic run. Below them lay the coastline that Allied troops would approach later that year. Ahead lay Buka. As the B-17 passed the airfield, men aboard could see Japanese fighters on the ground. Some were already beginning to take off. There were roughly 20 aircraft in sight, according to the official account. Zeamer now confronted the decision that defined the mission. He could break away, protect his crew, and return with incomplete coverage, or he could keep the B-17 straight while enemy fighters climbed toward it. He held the plotted course. The cameras continued running. That choice gave the reconnaissance system what it required, but it also gave the Japanese pilots time to organize. They did not approach as a scattered group chasing a fleeing bomber. They climbed above and ahead, preparing coordinated attacks against an aircraft that could not yet turn away. The first passes came as the photographic work neared completion. Cannon shells and machine gun fire struck the nose and cockpit. 5 crewmen were seriously wounded during the battle. Bombardier Joseph Sarnoski was hit, thrown from his position, and already suffering from grave wounds. He crawled back to his guns. Zeamer was struck in both arms and both legs. One leg was broken, his control pedals were slick with blood, and the aircraft still had hundreds of miles of hostile sky and ocean ahead. Yet 666 had obtained the photographs. The problem was no longer how to complete the map. It was how a shattered crew could keep the machine operating long enough to bring that map home. The Japanese fighters attacked from the direction where the B-17 was most vulnerable. They came from ahead, aiming at the cockpit and nose before passing along the bomber's length. Their cannon shells could disable the pilots, destroy the controls, or kill the men operating the forward guns. A single accurate burst might end the mission. Sarnoski remained the most important defender in that exposed section of the aircraft. Although already wounded, he returned to his position and fired into the approaching formations. During another frontal attack, a 20mm shell exploded inside the nose and hurled him backward beneath the cockpit. He dragged himself forward again and resumed firing. Sarnoski, resistance forced attacking pilots to pass through defensive fire before they could concentrate on Zeamer. He was credited with destroying 2 fighters during the action. Then his wounds finally overcame him. He collapsed across his guns and died at his station. Zeamer could not see everything happening behind him. He had been shot through his limbs, and one of his legs could no longer apply normal pressure to the rudder pedal. Blood loss weakened him with every minute, but the pilot still possessed something the aircraft urgently needed: an understanding of how his gunners could fight together. A bomber's defensive weapons did not make it invulnerable. They created overlapping fields of fire that worked only when the pilot presented useful angles to the gunners. If Zeamer turned too sharply, one gun position could mask another. If he remained predictable, the Japanese could line up repeated attacks against the cockpit. His task was to move enough to disrupt their aim without destroying the formation of his own defense. Zeamer used the controls despite his broken leg and damaged arms. He banked and maneuvered the fortress so the gunners could meet attacks from different directions. The crew called warnings through the interphone when the communication system still carried their voices. Each warning gave another man seconds to rotate a weapon, identify a target, and fire before the fighter crossed the bomber. This was not one weapon saving the aircraft. It was a damaged network of eyes, voices, controls, and guns continuing to function after several of its human components had been hit. Japanese pilots repeatedly pressed their attacks. Some approached from the front while others tried the sides or rear. Each pass consumed ammunition and exposed another section of the bomber to cannon fire. The B-17 accumulated holes, damaged equipment, and wounded men, yet its 4 engines continued producing power. The flight controls still answered. Its structure still carried the loads imposed by evasive movement. Those surviving systems created possibilities, but they could not choose how to use them. The crew did that. For approximately 40 minutes, the running battle continued. Zeamer's official citation credited the crew with destroying at least 5 hostile aircraft. Combat claims from FAST. Confused engagements were often difficult to verify precisely, and they should not be treated as a perfect count. What mattered inside 666 was more immediate. Every fighter that abandoned an attack, lost position, or failed to place decisive fire into the bomber gave the crew another few seconds. Those seconds accumulated. The Japanese formation had risen quickly to intercept the B-17, and the battle carried it away from Buka. Fuel, ammunition, damage, and distance now worked against the attackers. They had prevented neither the photographic run nor the bomber's departure from the target area. Eventually, they broke contact. Silence did not mean safety. It revealed the damage that combat noise had hidden. Sarnoski was dead. Several men required urgent treatment. Zeamer was fading in and out of consciousness, but he initially refused attention while enemy aircraft remained close enough to return. Only after the attack ended did he relinquish the controls. Another crewman now had to fly a battered aircraft across hundreds of miles of ocean. Behind him, the surviving men faced a different kind of battle. They had to slow Zeamer's bleeding, care for the other wounded, assess the aircraft, and preserve the exposed reconnaissance film. They had survived the interception. They had not yet survived the journey home. Co-pilot John Britton took over a cockpit that had been struck repeatedly from the front. The aircraft remained flyable, but normal flight now demanded constant interpretation of damaged instruments and controls. A B-17 could tolerate the loss of individual components because its essential functions were distributed across a large airframe. That redundancy had limits, and nobody aboard knew how close 666 had come to crossing them. The fortress had to descend from its mapping altitude. At high altitude, the crew depended on oxygen equipment that battle damage could compromise. Descending reduced that danger and brought the aircraft into denser air, where its engines, controls, and wounded occupants behaved differently. It also consumed altitude that could never be recovered if more engines failed. Britton therefore inherited more than the control wheel. He inherited a sequence of choices about altitude, engine power, fuel, and the shortest credible route toward help. Beside him, Zeamer continued. trying to command the return. The official account records that he directed the flight, despite losing consciousness repeatedly. His knowledge of the aircraft, route, and crew still mattered even when he could no longer remain continuously alert. A wounded pilot had become a fading source of information inside a system now operated by others. Behind the cockpit, the surviving crew divided their attention. Some watched for Japanese fighters that might resume the attack. Others checked weapons, structural damage, fuel indications, and the condition of the engines. The wounded required pressure on their injuries, and whatever first aid could be managed inside a vibrating bomber. There was no doctor aboard and no stable treatment room. Every task took place among ammunition, torn metal, scattered equipment, and the noise of 4 radial engines. They also had to protect the mission's least dramatic cargo. The exposed film contained overlapping images that could be processed into mapping coverage. It was physically small compared with the aircraft carrying it, yet if the film were ruined by damage, careless handling, or loss of the bomber, the entire flight would become strategically empty. Saving the crew and saving the reconnaissance material had become the same operation. That connection explains why the B-17's survival cannot be reduced to its reputation for toughness. The aircraft's structure absorbed damage without immediate collapse. Its engines provided continued power, and its duplicated control positions allowed another pilot to take command. But metal alone did not descend the aircraft. Redistribute labor, treat casualties, monitor fuel, or choose a destination. Design created options. Crew coordination converted those options into additional miles. The ocean beneath them offered almost no margin for a final mechanical failure. A forced landing at sea could break the bomber apart or trap injured men before they escaped. Even a successful ditching would leave them far from rapid medical treatment. Every mile toward New Guinea therefore changed their odds twice. It brought the aircraft closer to a runway and the wounded closer to surgeons. The crew could not know whether Zeamer would remain alive for the next hour. Blood loss had already reduced his ability to speak and remain conscious. Sarnoski could no longer be saved. The other wounded men endured the long return without knowing which injury might become fatal before landing. 666 continued southwest. Its engines did not need to perform perfectly. They needed to produce enough combined power for long enough. Its controls did not need to feel normal. They needed to answer Britton's inputs without jamming, separating or sending the aircraft beyond recovery. The crew did not need to restore the bomber in flight. They needed to prevent each surviving function from becoming the next failure. That distinction was the heart of their survival. They were not repairing 666. They were managing its remaining life. After hours over water, land finally appeared ahead. The sight did not end the emergency, because a damaged heavy bomber remained most vulnerable during approach and landing. Power changes could expose an injured engine. Lower speed could reveal hidden control problems. The undercarriage and brakes had endured the same battle as the rest of the aircraft. Britton still had to place the Fortress onto a runway without destroying the men he had carried so far. Behind him lay one dead crewman, several wounded men, and the film from Bougainville. Ahead lay the final test of every system still functioning. Port Moresby lay beyond the Owen Stanley Mountains on New Guinea's southern side. Crossing that range required altitude the damaged bomber might no longer achieve safely. Zeamer understood that trying to reach the departure base could turn survival into a fatal gamble. During one of his conscious intervals, he directed the crew toward Dobodura on the eastern coast. Dobodura was closer and avoided the mountain crossing. It offered an Allied runway and medical help, but reaching it did not guarantee a safe landing. Battle damage had disabled the B-17's flaps and brakes. The flaps normally increased lift and drag, allowing a heavy aircraft to approach more slowly and descend at a controlled angle. Without them, Britton had to bring 666 in faster than usual. Without reliable brakes, that additional speed would remain after the wheels touched the runway. The landing therefore became another mechanism problem. The engines had carried the bomber to land, but now their power had to be reduced without allowing the aircraft to stall. The controls had survived the fight, but they had to keep the Fortress aligned at low altitude. The landing gear had to extend and bear the aircraft's weight. Finally, Britton needed some method of stopping before the runway ended. He lowered the damaged bomber toward Dobodura. There could be no ordinary approach built around predictable flap settings and braking distances. Every correction had to account for the aircraft's higher speed and uncertain response. The wounded men could do little except brace themselves inside the perforated fuselage. 666 reached the runway and touched down. The wheels remained on the ground, but the bomber continued rolling with almost no effective braking. As the end of the strip approached, Britton deliberately turned the aircraft into a ground loop. The heavy Fortress swung around on the runway and lost its remaining forward speed. It stopped without adding significant damage or inflicting further injuries on the crew. Only then did the mission become a return rather than an attempted return. Ground personnel reached an aircraft marked by machine gun and cannon strikes. Accounts differ slightly when describing the total damage, and later retellings often turn uncertain counts into exact legend. Contemporary and official summaries agree on the essential scale. The bomber had absorbed nearly 200 projectile strikes, including several cannon hits, while remaining airborne and controllable. The more important count was human. Sarnoski had died. Zeamer and several others were wounded, some seriously. The men who had remained functional during the flight now transferred responsibility to medical personnel on the ground. Zeamer's survival was still uncertain. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood, suffered a broken leg, and carried numerous fragments from the attack. His part in the story did not end with an effortless recovery after a heroic landing. He required prolonged treatment and would not return to duty for many months. The distinction matters because survival was not the same as escaping consequence. Sarnoski paid with his life. Other crewmen carried wounds from a mission whose photographic result would be viewed far from the aircraft. Meanwhile, the reconnaissance film left the bomber and entered another network. Technicians had to develop it without destroying the exposed images. Photo interpreters had to identify terrain, coastlines, reefs, installations, and features relevant to military planning. Cartographic specialists then had to turn overlapping photographs into products that commanders and landing forces could use. The camera aboard 666 had not created a finished invasion map. It had collected raw visual evidence. The strategic value appeared only after laboratories, interpreters, mapmakers, planners, ships, and troops acted upon that evidence. This was the larger system hidden inside the bomber's survival. Zeamer's crew had not merely brought themselves home. They had preserved the only physical record capable of moving what they had seen into Allied planning rooms if the aircraft had crashed at sea. The cameras might have vanished with it. If the film had been destroyed, courage alone could not reproduce the coastline. If the bomber had turned away too early, the photographic sequence might have contained a fatal gap. Instead, the images survived intact enough to be used. The men at Dobodura saw a wrecked bomber and a devastated crew. The planners who later received the processed material saw Bougainville's western approaches with new precision. 666 had completed the first half of the mechanism. Now the maps could begin the second. The images from 666 did not dictate the invasion plan by themselves. Reconnaissance from other aircraft, intelligence reports, coast watchers, charts, and operational requirements all contributed to Allied decisions. The June mission supplied one important layer inside that larger body of evidence. Its value was precision where older information could be dangerously approximate. Bougainville was not an empty shape on a map. It was a large mountainous island covered by dense jungle, crossed by rivers, and bordered by reefs and uncertain coastal approaches. Pre-war charts did not always place features accurately. In some surveyed areas, later aerial work revealed that the recorded coastline was miles from its actual position. That kind of error was not academic to an amphibious force. Landing craft navigated toward narrow beaches, while transports remained exposed offshore. A misplaced coastline could disrupt timing, strand vessels, or deliver troops to terrain different from what their commanders expected. Photographs helped planners replace inherited assumptions with observable detail. The camera system aboard 666 had recorded the ground from multiple angles. When interpreters aligned those images, they could distinguish elevation, drainage, vegetation patterns, settlements, airfields, and coastal features. Mapmakers could then reproduce selected information at scales useful to operational staffs and units moving ashore. The final product was not perfect. Cloud, jungle canopy, changing tides, and the limits of photographic interpretation still concealed hazards. But the planners no longer depended solely upon obsolete charts and scattered descriptions. This was the system consequence of one aircraft holding a straight line under attack. On November 1, 1943, Allied landing craft approached Cape Torokina, just north of Empress Augusta Bay. The operation did not aim to conquer every mile of Bougainville immediately. Instead, American forces intended to seize and defend a lodgment where airfields could be constructed. Those airfields would help isolate Rabaul, the major Japanese base to the northwest. The objective therefore linked a beach to a regional air campaign. Marines of the 3rd Marine Division went ashore under naval gunfire and aircraft support. They encountered hostile fire, difficult surf, thick vegetation, and terrain that no photograph could make easy. Landing craft still grounded or suffered damage. Men still had to fight across beaches and through jungle. Reconnaissance reduced uncertainty. It did not remove resistance. The Japanese responded from the air, on land, and at sea. During the night after the landing, a Japanese naval force moved toward Empress Augusta Bay. American cruisers and destroyers intercepted it in the battle fought offshore. On land, the beachhead remained under pressure, while engineers and troops expanded the perimeter. Nothing about these events supports the claim that one B-17 mission won Bougainville. The stronger conclusion is more revealing. Modern amphibious warfare depended on accumulating thousands of small informational advantages before soldiers reached the shore. Aerial photographs became maps. Maps informed plans. Plans positioned ships, landing craft, artillery, supply dumps, defensive lines, and future airfields. Every stage required different specialists, yet each stage depended on the survival of the information collected earlier. The beachhead was secured and expanded. Airfields constructed near Torokina allowed Allied aircraft to operate closer to Rabaul, that helped tighten the network of bases surrounding the Japanese stronghold. Rabaul was not taken by a direct assault. It was increasingly neutralized and bypassed as Allied air and naval power restricted its usefulness. The strategic outcome emerged from many operations conducted by American, Australian, New Zealand, and other Allied forces across the region. 666 belonged inside that coalition story, not above it. Its crew provided knowledge that others converted into action. The mission also exposed a striking asymmetry. Japan had fighters at Buka capable of intercepting and nearly destroying the reconnaissance aircraft. Those fighters inflicted devastating damage and killed Sarnoski. Yet tactical success required more than hitting the bomber. The Japanese pilots also had to prevent its information from reaching the Allied system. They failed at that final step. 666 escaped with the film. Once the negatives entered processing rooms and mapping sections, the attack could no longer erase what the camera had recorded. A temporary act over Bougainville had become durable military knowledge. The bomber survived because its crew preserved its remaining functions. The photographs mattered because an entire organization was waiting to use them. The survival of 666 soon attracted the kind of storytelling that turns mechanisms into myths. The aircraft became an unwanted wreck rescued by misfits, armed with 19 firing guns, and made almost indestructible through defiance. Parts of that picture rest on evidence. Other parts grew sharper and more dramatic each time the story was retold. The distinction does not weaken the mission. It reveals what the crew actually accomplished. 666 was an older B-17E that had already experienced demanding service. Zeamer's men did take an aircraft others regarded as worn and prepare it for specialized reconnaissance work. They removed unnecessary weight, improved its mechanical condition, and increased the defensive firepower available to the crew. They also arranged the nose armament to answer the frontal attacks becoming common in combat. The famous claim of 19 guns needs qualification. Evidence from the aircraft's operational records indicates 16 active 50 caliber weapons, with 3 additional guns carried as replacements. Those spares were useful because a damaged or jammed weapon could be substituted during extended operations. They did not mean 19 men could fire 19 guns simultaneously. The accurate version is still extraordinary. A standard heavy bomber had been adapted locally by men who understood the threats they were facing. Their changes were not secret technology. They were practical responses involving weight, fields of fire, weapon reliability, and a mission requiring the aircraft to operate alone. One modification gave Zeamer access to a forward-firing gun controlled from the cockpit. That did not transform the B-17 into a fighter. It gave the pilot a narrow opportunity to fire at an attacker passing directly through the aircraft's forward line during the battle. Zeamer used that weapon, while also controlling the bomber. It was one additional option, not a protective shield. The Japanese response demonstrated why no amount of added armament could guarantee survival. Their fighters approached in coordinated frontal attacks because the B-17's nose offered a route toward the pilots and essential controls. They used cannon as well as machine guns. Their first effective passes wounded much of the crew, killed Sarnoski, damaged critical systems, and brought 666 close to destruction. The countermeasure worked tactically. It simply did not finish the aircraft before the defensive network adapted. Once free from the rigid mapping course, Zeamer could maneuver more aggressively. His turns complicated the attackers' aim and exposed them to different gun positions as they passed. Warnings from crewmen allowed gunners to shift attention before each approach. No single movement or weapon defeated the Japanese formation. The attacks became progressively less efficient as distance, fuel, ammunition, and defensive fire accumulated against the interceptors. Claims about the number and type of Japanese aircraft also require care. American wartime accounts described roughly 20 fighters taking off and credited the B-17 crew with several destroyed. Later versions often present every attacker as a zero and every claimed victory as independently confirmed. The combat was too fast and confused for that certainty. At least one twin-engine Japanese fighter may have participated alongside single-engine aircraft. Official citations preserve American combat claims, but a citation is not the same as a complete Japanese loss record. The survival mechanism does not depend on the largest possible enemy count. Even the conservative evidence describes a lone mapping bomber enduring a coordinated interception for about 40 minutes. 5 men were seriously wounded during the action. The pilot lost effective use of his limbs and repeatedly lost consciousness. The hydraulic, oxygen, communication, braking, and flap systems suffered damage or failure. One crewman died defending the nose. Those conditions are enough to explain why the return seemed impossible. They also separate 3 factors often blended together. Luck meant no projectile caused immediate structural collapse. Fuel ignition, or the loss of all engine power. Design meant the aircraft retained redundant crew positions, distributed weapons, structural strength, and enough controllability after multiple systems failed. Skill meant the crew recognized those surviving options and used them before time ran out. Remove any one of the 3, and 666 may disappear into the Solomon Sea. The bomber was not indestructible. It remained alive just long enough for its crew to keep choosing correctly. The crew's decorations later gave the mission a clear place in American military memory. Zeamer and Sarnoski received the Medal of Honor for separate actions during the same flight. The 7 other crewmen received the Distinguished Service Cross. The National Museum of the United States Air Force describes them as the most highly decorated American aircrew in history. That distinction can make the episode appear complete. A desperate mission produced extraordinary awards, and the survivors returned to receive recognition. The physical aftermath was slower and less symmetrical. Sarnoski could not be present when the account became famous. His choice to crawl back to the nose guns had protected the cockpit during the most dangerous phase of the attack. It also consumed the last strength available to a mortally wounded man. He died before 666 reached New Guinea. Zeamer remained in danger after the aircraft stopped. His broken leg, blood loss, and fragment wounds required extensive medical treatment. For several days, survival was not certain. He eventually recovered sufficiently to return to duty, but he did not simply walk away from Dobodura and resume flying combat missions. The body that had kept the bomber maneuvering needed months to heal. Other crewmen carried their own wounds and memories. Their awards recognized individual courage, yet their survival had depended on actions that resisted clean separation. A warning shouted through the aircraft gave a gunner time to turn. A gunner S-burst forced an attacker to alter course. A pilot S-bank opened a field of fire. A navigator or radio operator helped find a reachable runway. The co-pilot converted that heading into a landing without flaps or brakes. Medical personnel then inherited the struggle from the aircrew. No single medal could represent that entire chain. The same was true of the people who processed the film. They faced none of the gunfire over Buka, but the mission's promised result depended upon their precision. Poor development could destroy the images. Faulty interpretation could misidentify terrain. Inaccurate reproduction could carry error into the hands of planners and troops. Survival preserved the evidence. Technical labor made the evidence operational. 666 also survived the day in a literal sense. The aircraft was damaged heavily, but it was not abandoned at Dobodura. Ground crews repaired it and returned it to flying condition. That later work belongs to a different phase from the crew's fight home. During the mission, the men had managed failures without restoring the aircraft. Afterward, maintainers could inspect damaged systems, replace components, patch the structure, and test whether the bomber was safe to fly again. The difference is important. In the air, survival meant using what remained on the ground. Recovery meant rebuilding what had been lost. The fortress continued in service, but did not become an immortal combat relic. It was eventually returned to the United States and scrapped after the war. No complete aircraft survives in a museum under its original serial number. Its physical disappearance allowed photographs, paintings, and retellings to shape the public image. That is one reason the legend became easier to simplify. The aircraft could be remembered as a supernatural gunship instead of a worn machine with measurable limitations. Zeamer's crew could be described as fearless misfits, rather than trained men making calculations under pressure. Japanese pilots could become a faceless swarm, instead of opponents applying a dangerous interception method. The surviving documentation gives a more complicated and more useful story. The enemy correctly identified the bomber's vulnerability. Their frontal attacks caused catastrophic human and mechanical damage. The B-17's construction prevented some failures from becoming immediate destruction. Local modifications gave the defenders more ways to respond. Crew coordination kept those options connected after normal systems began breaking. Finally, the decision to divert to Dobodura avoided a mountain crossing the damaged bomber might not have completed. Survival was therefore not one miraculous moment. It was a sequence in which every successful choice purchased enough time for the next choice to matter. By the time the aircraft was repaired, its most important cargo had already moved onward. The images had left the wounded bomber and entered the machinery of an approaching invasion. 666 would eventually vanish into scrap. What its crew brought home did not. On the morning of June 16th, the camera was the smallest important machine aboard 666. It had no power to defend itself, treat a wound, choose a runway, or interpret the coastline passing beneath it. Its only task was to keep recording while the bomber held a straight and dangerous course. Everything else happened so that those exposures could survive. The crew first had to resist the instinct to abandon the mapping run when Japanese fighters began climbing from Buka. Then Sarnoski had to defend the nose after he was already wounded. Zeamer had to keep maneuvering with both arms and legs hit. The gunners had to remain connected after damage disrupted their aircraft. Britton and the others had to take over functions that wounded men could no longer perform. Finally, the bomber had to reach Dobodura and stop without working flaps or brakes. Each step answered the same question differently. What allowed them to continue operating? Not a single weapon. Not one famous decision isolated from everything around it. Not the B-17's structure acting by itself. 666 survived through layers. The aircraft absorbed damage without losing every essential function at once. Local modifications expanded the crew's defensive choices. Training allowed men to exchange roles and continue flying after the normal command arrangement collapsed. Judgment prevented them from attempting the dangerous crossing over the Owen Stanley Mountains. Luck kept shells from finding the few places where one strike could still have ended everything. Those layers did not protect everyone. Sarnoski died inside the nose he had defended. 5 crewmen were seriously wounded in the action. The aircraft that returned was not proof that heavy bombers could casually absorb unlimited punishment. It was evidence that redundancy matters only when people recognize what remains and act before it disappears. Months later, landing craft approached the western coast of Bougainville. The men aboard those vessels faced reefs, surf, enemy fire, jungle, and charts that reconnaissance could improve but never make perfect. Among the information available to their planners were aerial images obtained through missions like the flight of 666. The photographs were one contribution among many. They did not win the campaign alone. They helped transform an uncertain coastline into terrain that could be studied, reproduced, and incorporated into an operational plan. That was the consequence Japanese pilots had nearly prevented. Their attack devastated the bomber and its crew, but destruction of the aircraft was only the immediate objective. To erase the mission, They also had to destroy the film or stop it from reaching the organization waiting behind it. They did neither. Once 666 landed, its information passed from aircrew to technicians, interpreters, mapmakers, commanders, ships, and troops. The lone bomber had reached the edge of a much larger Allied system. That system gave meaning to its return. Years afterward, the aircraft itself was scrapped. Its engines, repaired structure, extra weapons, and camera installation disappeared. The legend remained, sometimes carrying larger numbers and cleaner explanations than the evidence supports. The documented story needs no inflation. 9 men entered hostile airspace in a single aging B-17. 1 died, several were gravely wounded, and the pilot repeatedly lost consciousness. Yet the aircraft remained functional long enough for its crew to preserve the mission and one another. Return in this case was not the opposite of damage. It was what became possible when damage failed to break every link at the same moment. The opening object was a camera waiting for a straight line over Bougainville. The final result was a roll of film carried through cannon fire, blood loss, open ocean, and a landing without brakes. 666 came home because machine, crew, and supporting system each supplied what the others lacked. And the maps came home because they kept that chain alive for a few more miles. If you value evidence-based stories of wartime survival, subscribe for the next documentary.